Okay, so now we're going to talk a little about a classic Robert Sapolsky topic, which is stress. So we have two connected questions here. Claudia from Romania asks, is there such a thing as a healthy dose of stress? Can you habituate to stress, or does every stress response cause damage to the brain and the amygdala to grow? Is there any truth to the saying, what doesn't kill you makes you stronger? And then JP from Minneapolis says, I've always heard that stress suppresses the immune system because cortisol is anti inflammatory, but you've said in some talks that acute stress may actually temporarily boost immune health. Can you elaborate on the relationship between stress and immunity and explain mechanistically how chronic stress can have the opposite impact of short term stress in some areas?
Two great questions that are highly interconnected. By the way, the name cortisol, that's the name of the main glucocorticoid stress hormone in humans. So for our simplifying purposes, secreting cortisol is synonymous with what your body does when you're stressed. Okay, so everybody knows by now we're about 90 years into stress being a medical term. Stress is bad for you. Stress is bad for you. Every outpost in your body, chronic stress can make you sick, make you more vulnerable to other sources of disease, make it harder to repair. All of that stress, bad news, stress, bad news. The question is stress always bad news? And the answer is no. And when you think about it, it actually makes intuitive sense. So you take somebody who's now dealing with the notion of stress. What is stress? Stress is an environmental, a physical, a psychological challenge to your equilibrium. And your body then has to do some stuff, including secreting cortisol, to reestablish equilibrium. Jargon from ninth grade biology, to reestablish homeostasis. Jargon from biology in the last 20 years or so, to reestablish allostasis. Okay, so a challenge comes along. So are all challenges terrible? Are all challenges bad news for you? And absolutely not. And what we have here is the classic demonstration of this for people in the business of what is called the inverse U relationship. We've got increasing amounts of stress, increasing amounts of stimulation, increasing amounts of cortisol, increasing amounts of anything. And you see something that makes total obvious sense. If you got too little of it, you're bored out of your mind. If you got too much of it, you're stressed out of your mind. And if it's the optimal in between, it's great. We love it. We call it stimulation. What is stimulation? That's the correct amount of stress. It's a challenge. It's a challenge that's challenging enough so that you're not bored, but it's not so challenging that you develop a sense of helplessness. And whether you are a developmental psychologist or a gerontologist and everything in between, you know that too little stimulation is just as bad as too much. Okay, so we've got that. And we wind up thus having in the middle is this concept of good stress. Good stress, what constitutes a good stressor? Some of its parameters. It's not too severe. It doesn't last for too long. Roller coaster rides are not 3 weeks long, that kind of thing. They occur with an overall setting of benevolence. You get on the roller coaster, there's a good chance you're going to feel queasy. It's not likely you're going to be decapitated. It's an overall safe environment. And under those conditions, what are we doing when we're stimulated? We're willing to give up a little control and a little predictability to be surprised. Massive amount, not so good. None whatsoever, not so good. And that's in a gradient with all sorts of stuff. I mean, you take a baby and you never touch the baby, and that counts as the wrong side of this inverse U. And you like scratch the baby's belly now and then, it's that stimulation. And now you scratch the baby's belly with sandpaper. And most people would say that's probably on the extreme side. It's the same just differing intensities, too little, optimal, too much. So we now have this issue of a lot of stuff in the world of stress has this inverse U relationship. And some of the time, what we're most aware of is the difference between the right amount and too little. Some of the time, what we mostly focus on is the right amount and too much. So what could be some of these circumstances where we see it comes out with the stress system is how severe the challenge is to your equilibrium, how severe the stressor is, and how long it goes on. And one of the themes that you see is short term in the early phases of a moderate stressor. Most of the stuff that goes on then is good. You increase the amount of glucose and oxygen delivery to your brain. Your synapses become more excitable. You release more of this neurotransmitter dopamine, which is about anticipation and motivation and reward. Your memory is enhanced. You get just the right level of sensory vigilance. That's you're being stimulated. You're stimulated and things are working well. Your brain's being washed in good stuff and you feel motivated and your memory is good. And what we see with all of those is if it goes on for too long, every one of those benefits not only goes back to baseline, but winds up going below. Chronic stress, and there's less glucose and oxygen delivery to like some very vulnerable parts of your brain. Chronic stress, you get depleted of dopamine. Why chronic stress can lead to depression. Chronic stress, you get memory problems. You get vigilance that is so vigilant 24/7. You get an anxiety disorder. Okay, so we've got our optimal curve. So we see that in terms of, is all stress bad? No, you want to get just the right amount. And we love it. We pay money to have the optimal level of stress to be stimulated. And this exactly applies as well to the inflammatory system. And what you see is massive amounts of stress hormones suppress inflammation, moderate amounts enhance it. The same exact picture there. Okay, so we see these different patterns here. So the question becomes, as raised in the second question, what are the mechanisms? What's the nuts and bolts to explain what's a very tough problem? We're accustomed to the idea, the more of whatever you get. More of the stimulus, you secrete more of this, or you secrete less. There's a linear relationship, and instead, there's this weird inverse. There's an optimum right in the middle there. How does the brain pull this off? And there's two totally cool mechanisms for this. First off, so we've already heard that you secrete a hormone like cortisol, and it gets into your cells, like your neurons in the brain, where it binds to a receptor for cortisol. And the way it works is that this receptor in cortisol goes and does something to your genes. Critically, in parts of the brain, there are two different types of receptors for cortisol. One of them is a lot stickier for cortisol. Jargon, it has a much higher affinity. It has an order of magnitude higher affinity. It is much better at grabbing onto any cortisol coming in through the bloodstream. So what we got here is, this is receptor type number one. And as you begin to raise levels of cortisol and stress and stimulation, it rapidly fills up. And soon it's 100% full and it's maxed out. And what does this one mediate? All the good effects, all the great short-term moderate stuff. And it's only when you've now been churning along for minutes, hours, decades, or whatever, that you begin to secrete enough of it so that the much sloppier type 2 receptor begins to bind them. And what it does is it offsets all the good stuff that type 1 is causing and more than offsets it. And it's this 2 receptor system, which is so beautiful and elegant. And that's a means by which, the more of this, the more you get a straight linear system. Have 2 messengers with very different sensitivities, and you can get all sorts of interesting curves and sigmoidal stuff like that, which is totally elegant stuff. And what that raises is all sorts of interesting possibilities. My lab years ago, for example, did some gene therapy so that in the brain, we boosted up the amount of number 1 type receptor in certain brain regions, and we made rats who had better memory during stress, things of that sort. Okay, so that's the first one. Here's how you differentiate between how long has the stressor been going on. It's only when it's chronic that you start filling these up, or how severe is the stressor, you flood the system. There's one additional aspect to this that winds up being relevant to the inflammation type thing. So short-term stress does a different thing to inflammation than long-term stress. But what you also see is It also depends on which part of the body or which part of the brain. Turns out even a moderate amount of stress and cortisol secretion increases inflammation in two parts of the brain. And these are pretty cool parts, the hippocampus and the prefrontal cortex. And meanwhile, it doesn't do that at all in other areas like the hypothalamus. Whoa, how does that happen? It's the same hormone getting to all three areas where it has the same type of receptor, the same either type 1 or type 2, it's got the same, it's the same receptor. And in this part of the brain, it increases inflammation, but the same exact thing in another part doesn't do it. Or you could get an even more dramatic example. If you're under lots and lots of stress, a part of your brain called the amygdala pumps out a growth factor, which causes the amygdala to get bigger and more excitable. And that's how stress gives you an anxiety disorder. And that's due to the release of something called BDNF, brain-derived neurotrophic. Meanwhile, next door in the hippocampus, lots of stress, and the hippocampus atrophies and memory gets worse. And that's because you decrease the levels of this brain-derived neurotrophic factor. How do you do that? It's the same hormone getting to the amygdala and the hippocampus, where it's got the same types of receptors, and they do absolutely opposite things. And here's where you see one additional cool piece of the story. What you have is, okay, here we've got in the hippocampus, the cortisol in both the hippocampus and amygdala comes in and binds to the receptor, where the hormone receptor complex goes to the DNA and has an effect on this gene. And what we see is in the hippocampus, it inhibits this gene from that growth factor. In the amygdala, it does exactly that. How does it do that? Because of these things called receptor cofactors floating around inside the neurons. In the amygdala is the green one, and inside the hippocampus are the orange ones. When the green one latches on, it throws the on switch here. When it's the orange one, it throws the off switch. So this begins to give you the means of, well, what does stress do? It depends in what part of the body, how severe of a stressor, and how long it goes on. This is totally cool mechanistic stuff, how you can pull off like opposing effects and things of that sort with inverse U's. What it mostly is telling us, though, is something halfway between is where most of us settle out. Now, what that raises, of course, is the issue of everybody doesn't have the same inverted U shape. Some people, their optimal stimulation point is just a little bit of challenge, and other people, it takes a mass individual differences. One person's idea of like a reckless, like really push the envelope day is to go bird watching in Central Park, and somebody else is to like sign up to be a mercenary in Yemen or something. Individual different shapes to the where's the optimal point. Where's that coming from? Genes, fetal environment, early upbringing, all that sort of stuff. What particular shape do you have to that curve? Which brings us to the final question there. Well, if some stress turns out to be good for you, is there some precedent for that whole notion of what doesn't kill you make you stronger? And this is a version of what that would look like. Here we have a moderate. Is that moderate? Here we have a manageable stressor. And what you see is you're functioning here. And afterward, in this Kelly Clarkson scenario, afterward, what doesn't kill you make you stronger? That's wonderful. That's all of that. That's not what you necessarily see. And what the rule is, it all depends on where you start off. If you start off downtrodden, what doesn't kill you makes you stronger isn't what occurs. Whatever happens pushes you down further. What doesn't kill you makes you stronger is a luxury of the lucky. If you're already starting off in good shape, adversity is an opportunity for growth and resilience and all of that. For most people out there, all you're doing is being kicked further down. So that isn't necessarily the case all the time.